So thank you so much, Deb, for inviting me to do that. I have to tell you that when Deb invited me to do this, she wanted me to talk about an article that I will talk about a little that I wrote over 30 years ago. And I don't know about all of you, but there are lots of things I did 30 years ago I can't remember at all. And although I do remember this article, I hadn't really thought a lot about it in quite a while. And so I thought, this is going to be interesting. So then I went back and reread the article. And so Deb, I have to thank you for that, because rereading it was, I mean, it's really interesting to read something that you wrote a long time ago and just see just how much you cringe when you read it, or how much you go, really? I wrote that? Gosh, what, like, where did I get that from? So the article, as I think some of you know, was called Women's Authorship of Jewish and Christian Literature in the Greco-Roman Period. It's a very factual and not terribly exciting title. And I want to talk about the piece itself and a little bit about sort of what I was doing and why I did it. And then what I'd like to do with you is walk you through some of the pieces of that, and maybe also tell you a little about sort of what I think about these things now, as opposed to what I thought when I wrote it. So at the point at which I wrote this article, which was I probably wrote it, I think, in 1990. And when I wrote it, the academic scholarship on Jewish and Christian women in the late Hellenistic and Roman periods, so this is between about the 4th century before the Common Era and up to the 5th century of the Common Era, so that's a span of about 1,000 years. The scholarship on Jewish and Christian women was still very much an emerging enterprise. It was still in some ways a very new and mildly transgressive field. I broke this project down into several parts. And the first one was, what did we know about women writers in the Greco-Roman period, whether they were Jews, Christians, anything else? The second part was on how I could place women's authorship within the larger context of what we know about writing and about how people disseminated their writings in this period. And then I thought some about questions about how you can identify the gender of an author in a writing where you don't know who the author was. And this is particularly an issue for this period, because there's a huge amount of literature, particularly literature that we think comes from either Jewish or Christian authors, where either it just doesn't say who wrote it, or it says who wrote it, but nobody believes that that's who wrote it. For example, a work written, let's say in the middle of the 2nd or the 3rd century, which claims to be the testament of the biblical Job, right? So nobody actually really thinks that Job was writing his will in, say, the middle of the 2nd century. And there's a ton of stuff that falls into this category. So that was one of the questions, is how do you figure out the gender of an author if you don't know who wrote it in the first place? And then one of the things I did in this, and we'll talk about it also again, was I looked at a very interesting and specific case of a debate that goes on among 2 Christian voices, one of whom clearly identifies as an Orthodox, at this point we mean probably a Nicene Christian in the 4th century, and somebody who identifies as a dissident group that is a member of a group sometimes called the New Prophecy or the Montanists. And they have a debate in this text over the legitimacy of Christian women writers. Is it in fact okay for Christian women to write books in their own names, or is it not? I mean, this is like a gift. Imagine somebody actually, writes you a whole thing on this. And then the last thing I wanted to look at in this article was explanations for what turns out to be, as you'll see, the apparent absence of virtually any women writers. Why is it, right? Why are there, so few, if any, women writers? And last, so what? Like, okay, this is all interesting, but what are the implications of this if you are someone in my field who is interested in the study of both Jews and Christians in the sort of Greco-Roman Mediterranean? Like, okay, it's really interesting, but who cares? And why does it matter? So going back and reading this 30 some odd years later really was interesting. I wrote myself a little note. I'll tell you what it says, actually. I wrote myself a little note on the back of my photocopy of this, because I don't actually have my copy of the volume where I presently am. And I wrote myself a note and I said, well, I would do the following things differently, but it's not bad for something that I wrote in 1990. So that was the good news. I didn't cringe and sort of say, oh Lord, how could I possibly have written this thing? And, what was I thinking when I did it? But I thought I would update you a little. And what I wanted to say about that is, interestingly, the evidence for women writers in this period hasn't really changed in any substantial way. This is not the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi materials or anything else. It's not like somebody has suddenly discovered a whole cache of writings written by women and now you're like, oh yay, lots of new stuff I can work on. That is really not the case. We don't really have any new literature in any meaningful way that changes the data. But I think some of my ways of thinking about this have changed in the last 30 years. And in particular, what's important for me, and maybe this will be of interest to you, is that 30 years ago, attention to issues of gender construction, right? That is, to ideas about how people in antiquity thought about male and female, masculinity and femininity, and how this affected their thinking and their writing, was something that at least scholars in my field were just beginning to talk about. Barely. Scholars in other fields probably had been talking about it for a little longer, because scholars in other fields often were a little bit more theoretically self-conscious than people who do things like work on, ancient Judaism and early Christianity. But we've caught up, sort of. And so thinking about that certainly makes you think more, or not just about questions of, did a woman write this, but rather, what difference would it make if a woman wrote it? And can you tell? And just because a story is about a woman, does it suggest that maybe a woman wrote it or not? And what else might ancient writers be doing, both when they write about women, which is not what this talk is about, or even when they claim that a woman is the writer? And that is a somewhat more interesting thing for our purposes. So one of the things I wanted to do this evening, but it's become apparent to me sort of at the last minute that there are far too many of you to do this. I did want to know, and maybe we will have a little time for this in the questions, why this matters to you. Both you individually and maybe not you as a group, but certainly individually, why are you here tonight? And why is this interesting to you? It's interesting to historians, I think, for some very, what I hope are sort of obvious reasons, which is, if most of your historical evidence is coming from men and male writers, well, there are probably things they're not telling you, and there are probably things they don't know. And that's going to limit your ability to write a full historical reconstruction. I mean, this isn't just true for men, right? I mean, it's true if your history comes only from one small set of people. Your ability then to have a really full sense of what a culture looks like, or a historical moment looks like, makes a big difference. But that was certainly one of the reasons that I was interested in this. But it's important, I think, to note that this isn't just true about women. It really is true also that, first of all, most people in antiquity don't write. I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but most people in antiquity are not literate. They don't have the capacity to write. They don't have the means to write. They don't have the opportunity to write. And most people live their lives without writing. So that what this really means then is that the kind of picture we're going to get is a very, very sort of scarce and in some ways impoverished one. And so for me as a historian, this matters a lot. But I think that issue should matter for all of you as well, particularly if you read people's accounts of antiquity. And if people start saying to you, well, in antiquity, it worked like this or it worked like that, maybe this will make you somewhat more skeptical. And I mean that in a good way, of what people tell you, and of sort of wanting to say, well, okay, maybe I need to know it a little bit differently. So that's why it's important to me. But I also understand, and this was even true 30 years ago, that the specific issue of Jewish and Christian women writing is, I think, a somewhat different issue for many people than the issue of women writing generally, right? That is, I think, both contemporary Jewish and Christian communities have had sort of individual interests in that as well that relate to their own understandings as groups and communities. So, but maybe we'll get a chance to do that. So forgive me 1 second here to do this. I actually have to briefly go to the second version. I had sort of prepared two versions of this, one for if it was a smaller group where we could all chat, and the other for if it's a not so smaller group and chatting will be harder. And either way, it would have been good. So now I want to try to walk you a little bit through the material that I dealt with. And Deb, in 1 minute, I would be happy if you would put up on the screen the salient data one, but give me a minute to do this. So I want to start with kind of the obvious depressing fact, which is that the hard evidence for actual women authors of literary works from the Greco-Mediterranean in the two primary languages, which were spoken and used in that period, Greek and Latin, is exceptionally thin. Exceptionally thin. We know certainly that at least a few women produced literary compositions of some sort. This is uncontested, but very little of it survives. A handful of references in the works of what are almost all certainly male writers allude to the possibility of such work. Sometimes they do it in a neutral manner. Sometimes there's just mention, a work written by some woman. But sometimes they mention it quite critically, as in women really shouldn't be doing these things. And when they do it, they don't do it very well, and so forth. Most of the references that we have imply that elite women, so women who came from very wealthy families of the more privileged classes, were often literate, they were often well educated, and they both read and owned books. And interestingly, women scribes and copyists are explicitly mentioned in some cases, including most famously in the works of a 3rd century Christian writer named Origen, who talks about employing large numbers of women scribes and copyists. The demonstrable evidence for literary production by either Jewish or Christian women is even thinner than the evidence as a whole. So we don't actually have any texts in Greek or Latin, or for that matter, for Jewish women in Hebrew or Aramaic and Christian women in Syriac, that are explicitly said to be produced. Actually, let me say that we don't have any texts, no, that was right. Any ancient texts in Greek or Latin, Hebrew or Aramaic that are explicitly said to be produced by a Jewish woman. There is sort of one interesting exception that I really don't want to say any more about tonight, of a very late sort of alchemical work that is attributed to a woman who is called Mariah the Jew. But it's a very late work. It falls sort of to the very end of the period that I'm interested in, and it's kind of complicated. There are a tiny number of texts that are said to have been, or that claim to be the work of a Christian woman. And in a couple of instances, there's considerable weight to that claim, and nobody spends much time worrying about it. But the interesting thing is what I said to you before, which is that for reasons that are themselves quite interesting, Jews and Christians in this period seem to have produced a substantial number of texts where the author is either not named, and by the way, this includes all of the Gospels, which do not ever tell you who wrote them, right? The attributions of names and identities to the writers of the Gospels are all come from subsequent Christian traditions. But, you go back and read the text and they never tell you who wrote them, as opposed to something like the letters of Paul, where they both claim explicitly to be written by a person with a particular name. And in at least some of those instances, they probably are written by a person with that name. But there's this whole corpus of texts which either have no name, they're anonymous, or they have a name attached to them, but the name attached to them is just, as I said, nobody thinks, nobody's a big term, but it is simply implausible, if not impossible, that these texts are written by these various other people, Ezra, Job, biblical figures of all kinds. And that's not even to get into the question that some of you are probably familiar with, about the possibility that some of the letters of Paul, for instance, are actually written by somebody else in Paul's name. So this leaves open the possibility that some of these writings are in fact composed by women. And that, of course, will then get us to the problem of, okay, how could you tell? So let me now, if we could put up this list, Deb, so that people can see this. I'm going to walk you through some of this. I think, yeah, that you will eventually need to scroll down on this, but for now. So so here's a sort of list of the data that we have. First, we have works, 4 or 5 of them here, that explicitly claim to be written by a woman. I'm actually going to start from the bottom because the ones from the bottom are the least problematic. So, right, just stop right there, Okay, so the works composed by the early Byzantine Empress Eudokia in the 5th century, she wrote a number of things. We're fairly sure she wrote them. That's very nice. There is also a poetic composition written in the 4th century by a fairly elite woman named Teutonia Betitia Proba. I don't want to spend any time on it tonight, but we're fairly sure she wrote it. And then there's a slightly more interesting case of a pilgrimage diary written by a woman whose name, the question mark is for her name, it's not for the diary, whether her name was really Egeria, it may have been, it doesn't really matter. The work seems very clearly to be written by a woman. It's a wonderful, fascinating text, and I sort of highly recommend it. But again, there's very little debate about whether she wrote it, and it does very clearly seem to be a first-person account of a fascinating trip, essentially, to the Holy Land by a woman who seems to have started out in Spain. It's the first text that is in some ways the most interesting and the most, maybe controversial is the right word, because it claims to be the martyrdom diary of an early Christian woman who, in the account at least, is martyred sometime around the beginning of the 3rd century. And here I've given you, I won't read it now, but here is the passage that is the source of the claim that this part of the text was written by Perpetua. The diary is actually embedded in a larger text, which tells both what happened before and also what happened after, and her martyrdom account. Obviously, she doesn't write about her own death. So this is one of the more interesting texts and the more controversial ones. So then after that, we have a number of letters that are written by women. And this is in some ways, again, one of the least controversial issues. That women wrote letters is not particularly surprising. Elite women and elite men exchanged letters all the time. It was one of their primary ways of keeping in touch with each other at a distance. Some of these letters are very formal, and many of them are sort of really treatises about all kinds of things in the form of letters. We also have on papyrus documents ordinary letters written by women that are kind of what we would think of. Mom, I miss you. Please send me that nice pair of shoes that you got me. And by the way, we're running out of sugar. So we have a number of these things that survive in papyrus documents. Among the more interesting ones, though, are the 2 letters that I've identified here. One is a letter which travels with the letters of Jerome. For those of you for whom Jerome is not a familiar name, and I hope there aren't too many of you, among other things, Jerome is best known as the translator of the Bible from Greek and Hebrew into Latin in the edition known as the Vulgate. There are tons and tons of letters from Jerome, and many of them are to a circle of women with whom he was very close. And one of the closest was a woman named Paula, who with Jerome founded a pair of monasteries for men and women in Bethlehem. And this is a letter that claims to be by Paula and her daughter Eustochium to yet another woman, Marcella, in their circle. Interestingly, this letter, even though it says it's a letter from Paula and Eustochium to Marcella, is routinely taken by scholars to have been the work of Jerome himself, which is kind of interesting, because then you have a known male Christian writer composing a letter either for, or at least in the name of, a woman he knows well. And some scholars have now said, why don't we just take it for what it says it is, as actually Paula's own letter. But the more interesting letter to me and the one I talked about a lot in the article, is a letter that encapsulates a lot of these problems. So this letter is a relatively short letter. It claims to be by a woman named Mary or Mariah, who comes from a town called Casabola. Nobody really knows where Casabola was. To a well-known historical figure, the Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch in the early 2nd century, and along with a reply from Ignatius. But this is one of those classic falsely attributed things. Nobody thinks that Ignatius wrote that letter, nor that this is a letter addressed to the real historical Ignatius. And the letter is about offers support on the part of Maria to Ignatius concerning the appointment of several young men to positions, one as a presbyter and the other as a bishop in this town. And she offers a slew of scriptural explanations for why it's okay for young men to have positions of authority in the church. And the most interesting part of this is what comes at the very end, right? Where she seems to recognize that this is, a little dicey, right? So she says that she should tell him this. And so she says, I implore you, lest to you I seem to be someone excessive or acting ostentatiously or audaciously. For I have set forth these very words, not teaching you. One hears in the back of one's head, 1 Timothy 2:12, that women may not teach men, but merely bringing them to your remembrance, to the remembrance of my Father in God. So it's like here you have some kind of an allusion to the issue in a letter that is not written by the person who says she's writing it. So something very odd is going on here. Either there is a woman writing this letter in the name of a woman who she isn't to someone who isn't a real historical figure, or a man is writing a letter doing something that seems to be problematic for purposes of which we really cannot figure out. I mean, it's a very puzzling thing, but it's really very interesting. So can we scroll down here, please, for me? Thank you. Okay, so then the other things we have are instances of references to women writers without having the actual evidence of their compositions. And I gave you this example because it's one of the only instances for Jewish women. And this comes from an account in the writer Philo of Alexandria, who's describing a little monastic community that are called the Therapeutai, who live outside of Alexandria and are basically contemplative celibate philosophers. And at one point in the text, he says that the members of this community spend most of their time studying scriptures, reading the writers of the school's founders, and composing psalms and hymns to God. And since he says throughout this that the men and the women pretty much do all the same things, presumably here he's telling us that the women in this community are also writing psalms and hymns, but that's all he says. Another thing we have are collections of sayings that are attributed to women, mostly women who are described as prophets. And in terms of the Jewish and Christian examples, the most interesting ones are the sayings of women prophets in the Christian New Prophecy, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, and some references in a work called, this is the work I've talked about before, the Testament of Job, which might be Jewish, it might be Christian. Nobody really knows for sure. But in the end of this retelling and elaboration of the story of Job, Job gets a new family. He gets 7 sons, he gets 3 daughters. And in his last will and testament, he leaves his sons all the material stuff, but he leaves his daughters these physical shimmering bands of light, and they kind of go, what are we going to do with these? And he tries to assure them that these are far better than the material stuff that he's given the sons. And when they wrap these things around themselves, each of them starts speaking in angelic languages. And the text tells us that the hymns and the compositions of the daughters are preserved in something called the Hymns of Cassia and the Prayers of Amaltheus Keras. Then we also have some sayings of desert mothers. These are women monastics living in the deserts of Egypt in the 5th century. And these sayings are found in the much longer sayings of The much longer sayings of Christian desert fathers. And the two I thought you would particularly enjoy are two that are ascribed to a woman called Amma, or Mother Sarah. So these two old men, these anchorites, come to visit her, and they say, let's humiliate this old woman. And they say to her, be careful not to become conceited, thinking of yourself. Look how anchorites are coming to see me, a mere woman. But Amma Sarah said to them, according to nature, I am a woman, but not according to my thoughts. And then she also said to the brothers, it is I who am a man, you who are women. It's actually one of my favorite pieces. So can we scroll down a little bit more? Okay, but of course, one of the issues here, and I still sort of struggle with this, is how much of this stuff counts as writings, right? I mean, if women speak things, and the things they speak get written down, is that writing? And that's not just true for women, but it's true for any number of people, including, if one wanted to be mildly provocative, one could point out that we have no writings from Jesus. We have only sayings and stories about Jesus that come from other people. So does Jesus count as a writer? And there are lots of other people who fall into that category as well. But should we think of that as writing, or do we need a broader framework here, and is to raise the question of writers too narrow a framework? So the last text I wanted to put in front of you, and I'm trying to be mindful of the time, but Deb, I actually took my watch off, and so now my computer is not telling me the time. So somebody please
just keep going. We'll just,
okay, you'll holler when you need to stop.
Okay, we'll let you.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so this in some ways is my most favorite instance for tonight, and one that I took up in the article as well. This comes from a work that maybe dates to the 4th century. It's probably not earlier than the 4th century, partly for a bunch of reasons I won't go into here. But it's called The Debate Between a Montanist and an Orthodox. And it is written in the style of it sort of looks almost like, play dialogue with nothing else in it, where you get, one person says one thing, the other person responds, back and forth they go. And there are lots of these from the ancient world. This is just one particular form. But this one, the two speakers, who I think are represented as males, one of them is a member of the Orthodox Nicene Church, and the other one is a member of this dissident Christian group, which probably called itself the New Prophecy, but which was called by some others Montanists, after one of their 3 founders whom the group members called prophets. And one was named Montanus, and one Priscilla, and one Maximilla. So 2 women and 1 man. And the movement itself seems to have begun in the sort of the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century. So this is actually a fairly early Christian group, and which was well known even then for women prophets and the roles that it gave to women. So the section that I've given you here pertains to the question of whether or not women can be prophets, and whether or not they can write books in their own names. And it's important to note here that the sayings of the women Montanist prophets were collected in books, a few of which are then quoted in other writers, right? But we don't actually have the books themselves. So the Montanist here says, is not writing books the meaning of there's more that goes before this, but is not writing books the meaning of the statement, and this comes from 1 Corinthians 11:15, about praying or prophesying with uncovered head, right? So this is where Paul says to women that he prohibits them from praying or prophesying in the assembly, in the ecclesia, with their heads uncovered, right? Presumably that means they can do it as long as their heads are covered, but this is now the debate, right? And so the Orthodox says it certainly is. And then the Montanist says, well, then if the Holy Mary says, henceforth, all generations will call me blessed, this is understood, by the way, to be a prophecy, because Mary says, in the future, this is what's going to happen. The Montanist says, is she being outspoken and speaking in an unveiled manner or not? And the Orthodox says, no. She has the evangelist as her veil, for the gospel has not been written under her name, right? So this comes from the Gospel of Luke. So Luke is her cover. And the Montanist, sort of in an aggravated tone, presumably says something like, I don't love this translation, but basically is saying something like, right? Don't take your allegorical interpretation of this. This is not what the text says, and give it to me as though it's authoritative truth, as though it's a doctrine. And then a little later, the Montanist comes back to this and says, all right, so is it because Priscilla and Maximilla composed books that you don't receive them? This is the question with which this portion of the dialogue opens, right? Why don't you accept Priscilla and Maximilla? So the Montanist comes back to it now, and the Orthodox says, it is not only for this, but also because they were false prophetesses with their leader, Montanus. This is a really telling text in a lot of ways, in part because it reveals a number of things. First of all, it reveals that different Christian groups in the 4th century appear to have had different views about this, that the Montanists thought it was just fine, not just for women to be prophets, which, by the way, the Orthodox concedes is in fact acceptable, but because he says they composed books in their own name. So both they compose books and they do so in their own names and not under cover of some man. And so first we get an important issue, which is that whatever issue it is we're looking at, it is important to keep in mind that Christians in antiquity, and Jews as well, were not monolithic any more than they are in the 21st century. And people have very different views about all kinds of fairly contentious issues. I mean, this won't come as a surprise to you. But sometimes early Jews and Christians are painted as though they are much more homogenous than in fact they were. So this is a good reminder of that. But it's also, and I'm now going to do this terrible thing where I briefly have lost my train of thought. Oh, Lord, this is really awful. You have to give me 1 second and then I will see if I can remember what, I know. But it also goes back, thank you, to the issue of pseudepigraphy, right? And here it suggests something very interesting. So if you have a mainstream Orthodox position that says women can't write books in their own names, maybe they can write them, not even that part's not good, they clearly cannot write them in their own names. And you are a Christian woman and you wish to write something, what would you do? Would you write it in your own name? Or would you write it and stick somebody else's name on it, the name of a man? Or would you just write it with no name at all, right? And I don't think this is only an issue for Christian women in the Greco-Roman world. I think this has been an issue for women for a long time. It certainly was an issue for women writers, in the 19th and 20th century. And it then brings us back to this question of how could we tell? I want to stop very shortly here because I am kind of interested in some of your own thoughts about this, but I just want to say 1 or 2 more things about how you could tell, because how you could tell is a complicated problem, right? That is, do women write differently than men? And do they either write about different things than men? Do they write in different literary styles? How could you tell? And obviously, the only way you can try to figure this out is to have enough of a control case that you can ask yourself this, right? So if enough writings by women and enough writings by men, presumably you could sit and compare them, and then you could sort of say, okay, women's writing have certain characteristics and men's writing has certain characteristics, and there's not much overlap between them. So maybe I can use this to help me figure out something about the gender of an author when I don't otherwise know it. But there's also a danger there that becomes essentializing very quickly, right? So it might be the case that in some specific culture, men and women learn to write differently, or something is going on so that you do in fact have some differences. So in the article that I wrote, I talked about the work of a classicist named Mary Lefkowitz, who at the same time that I presented this paper at a conference, presented another paper at the same conference, at the same session, in which she had studied the poetry and other writings that survive from Greek women in sort of classical Athens. And she had some interesting things to say, that the writings that we have from women that she was looking at tended to focus on women's relationships with other women, on their affection for their childhood friends, on their affection for their daughters, tended to be much more interested in the minutiae of women's lives. And so she sort of thought, well, maybe here's a test. And maybe that's true, but I think that we have to be very careful not to assume that that goes very broadly, and that women as a whole do these kinds of things, and that these things aren't very culturally specific and very historically determined. So it's a really difficult question, and I have to tell you that I still don't know how to do this with the enormous number of texts we have. But my final thought about that for you, and then let's open it up to some conversation, is that when it comes up with texts that we particularly are invested in, so for example, in the writers of the Gospels, I think it's particularly important to be careful here, because at the point at which I wrote this piece, there were quite a number of scholars of the New Testament and early Christianity who wanted to at least explore the possibility that women had written some of the Gospels. And I think that's all well and good. I don't know how you could tell, but I think that's all, I think it's perfectly fine to think about it. But in the end, it's also important to ask what difference it would make. Like, is it better if one of the Gospels or two of the Gospels were written by women? What's it better for? Does it make them truer than if they weren't written by a woman? What is the use of this, and what do you have at stake in this? And how much can you walk away from it or let it be what it was, or to concede that there's just no way to know? So I'm going to stop there. There's lots more we could talk about, but I think I will just stop. And Deb, tell me now how you want to do this. You're going to mediate. Can I say one more thing? I have to say,
sure, absolutely.
There is a college classmate of mine on this grade, right? Hi, Peggy. Right. She texted me this bit, and her picture is right on my screen. I don't know how that happened, but I am looking. I see very few of you, but she's the one I see. So it's very exciting to see you, and to know that in this large group of people you can't see and don't really know, somebody you haven't seen in a long time has shown up. So it's really exciting. Thank you.
Great. So as most of you know who've been on these calls before, so if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, and I do think Ross's question about what does it matter to you, if it's a women's author or not, why are you here? I do think that that's a really interesting question for all of us to try to grasp a little bit. I do happen to think that Montanist Orthodox conversation that you pointed out was probably on Catholic Twitter the other day, back and forth.
But just to show you, I am not on Catholic. I'm not on Twitter.
It's mean. Okay, all right. So, I don't know, Peggy. Maybe you want to start us off with a question here, since this is your classmate challenge. Huh?
Well, first of all, it's just delightful to see Ross, and having participated in this series last spring, I think the class of 1970 at Smith has something to be proud of here. I
have lots to be proud of.
We do, don't we? And I did advertise it on our class Facebook page, so I don't know, there may be others on the call.
If you're out there, put something in the chat. Right.
In any event, I wanted to ask you how your methodology may have evolved over the years, in the 30 years since you've done this. I've read some of your work. I think it's really interesting. I also think, importantly, that although it's really good, but it's also accessible to people like me, who I'm not an expert in the ancient world, and yet I can read your work and get at least something out of it, which is not always the case. So how, you know what I mean. So I don't know how your methodology has evolved, and how how our ability to read these texts in a kind of inquisitive way may have evolved over the 30 years.
Thank you. Let me see, how much more time is it? Let me try to do this in a couple of minutes. So I think that the biggest difference, the biggest change for me in my work has really come around these issues of gender. And by gender, I mean not just, women. Really here, I mean gender is a much more sophisticated concept than just what's happened in English lately, and this kind of drives me nuts, which is, that the terms sex and gender have just become elided. And so gender has just become a sort of stand-in public term for, what do you think you are? Do you think you're male? Do you think you're female? And without any question of what does that mean, right? What's the package that goes along with that? But there certainly were moments in in the study of antiquity and just the study of history and women's studies and all these things, at which point people began to realize that these things were much more complicated, and also that they have a history, right? That is, they're not just given, they're not just out there. They have histories in antiquity, they have histories in modernity. The concept has a history. Nobody in antiquity talks about what we would call gender, right? I mean, they clearly talk about what it means to be male and what it means to be female. You see it even in that little snippet that I gave you of the sayings of Sarah, who sort of says to these men, I'm the true man, you're the women. It's an insult. But it also has things that go with it that we might not recognize. That is, it has ideas about what it means to be male that are culturally specific, and that for her are probably very much linked to ideas among probably Jews and Christians about the book of Genesis, about sort of, the divine creation of a being who is in Genesis 1, male and female altogether. And in Genesis 2-3, you get a very different story, right? So these kind of complex issues were not, these certainly weren't things I was trained to think about in graduate school. I wasn't trained to think about any of this in graduate school. Because when I went to graduate school, right after Peggy and I graduated from college, the study of women was barely on anybody's radar screen. And all right, one more, since you're the one who's asking this, we're barely on the radar screen of any of our teachers in college. Okay, and we went to a women's college. I don't even want to go there, right? But so eventually it became clear to me that I needed to think more, not just about, for example, whether a woman wrote some particular text. And I'll give you one more example of this, but what was going on in the way in which women are depicted in these texts. And are these really texts? Is it, when you have a story about a woman, is it a story about a woman? Is it about women? Or do male writers, and I think this is still true, I'm looking at you, Philip Roth, write, and lots of other people, but that's what popped into my head. Lots of male writers take female characters and impose on them all kinds of other issues that have nothing to do with the realities of women's lives. So women are sort of conveniently, as Claude Lévi-Strauss said famously, they are good to think with. They're good for men to think with. So women are and I'm watching wonderful comments and I'm really so sorry. I'll have to look at the chat afterwards. I'm sorry that I can't stop to read all your comments. So that, I would say, in some ways was the biggest thing that made me stop and have to rethink a lot of things. And I will do the 2-second pitch. So not long after I wrote this article, I published a book that was called Her Share of the Blessings, Women's Religions Among Pagans, Jews, and Christians, right? And it is the book that most people know me for, if they know anything, right? And it, for an academic book, it didn't sell badly. But in 2000, and I'm looking for the book. Give me 1 second. I'm going to do the show and tell. I can't resist, but I actually have to get up to reach the book. So in 2011, I published the book I would have written had I known what I was doing when I wrote Her Share of the Blessings, and it's this. And it's this book, which is called Unreliable Witnesses: Religion, Gender, and History in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. And, this is the book I would have written it many years earlier if I knew then what I know now. And you can almost see that in the book, right? There, one revisits the other. That being said, Her Share of the Blessings is much easier to read, I promise you. So I would say that's been the major issue for me. There's a lot of other stuff. One of the things I've learned is how little I knew when I did my earlier work, and how much more I've learned, but there's nothing you can do about that. You know more when you're 70 than you knew when you were 30, and one hopes. All right, so that's the answer to that.
Thanks, Peggy.
Email me.
Yeah. So I am going to just read a few of these things to you, Ross. And so Linda Gibler says, it seems to me that if writers in this area would likely be people of means and education, then it may be likely that the women who financed Jesus's mission could have been writers. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, kind of a lot. You want the short version or the long version?
Yeah.
So the short version would be this. I don't know that the correlation is, I think that women who wrote were disproportionately women who had the means, motive, and opportunity. So the means and the opportunity would certainly be education, and would be the leisure to do this. And the answer to that is maybe.
Okay.
Okay.
Hold on just a second. Somebody's got their mic not muted. Go ahead.
Okay, so the answer to that is certainly at one level, maybe. On the other hand, the claim that Jesus had lots of women were the financial supporters of Jesus, this gets us to these issues of gender, right? This turns out to be a much more complicated issue, and a number of scholars have written, because that claim comes actually from the author of the Gospel of Luke. And it's not a claim that you find in other gospels. It's not that the other gospels don't have women as devoted followers of Jesus, but the financial part of it comes particularly from this one passage. Now that I'm saying this, I actually think it's in Acts, and I would have to go back and double check because I can no longer memorize anything. But my larger point is this. It has been suggested that the claim that Jesus had the patronage of relatively elite women is the kind of claim that is made about men who are potentially problematic, right? So one of the things you do when you claim that a man has a certain kind of female patronage is that you are drawing on, now this is the use of a female figure for something else, right? So maybe it is in fact true that Jesus had female supporters, and I'm actually, financial support, and I'm not saying that he didn't. I'm only saying that the claim has certain utility for the writer of the text. And we know this because we know that it goes on in other male writers as well who do this. And so, yes, maybe they could, but it's a lot of jumps along the way. And the reality of it is we know very little about these women, and we know very little, except that most of the followers of Jesus are likely to have been people in the Galilee around him who we think were mostly, although maybe not entirely, relatively not so elite and not so particularly wealthy. But there may have been some. I guess I want to say this. I don't think it's impossible. I just think it's a more complicated question than it looks like on the surface.
Great. We have Jill Caldwell is saying, recognizing that we'll never know, it's important to me to think about women writing because at least the Catholic Church is so focused on men and gives very little credit to women for any accomplishments. Personally, I've always believed that Luke was written by a woman. So, but I think she gets at the heart of why most of us find this topic important. And the question is, do we overdraw because we want to, find feminism in the church today and equality in the church today in women's? And so that's a good question.
Can I comment on that briefly?
Absolutely. Yes.
So one is my dearly beloved colleague, Mary Rose D'Angelo, who was my co-editor of the Women in Christian Origin, who's just a brilliant scholar, has a couple of pieces in that volume, in the Women in Christian Origins volume, and I think a number of articles elsewhere, where she talks about the representation of women in Luke and in Acts. And it's more, again, it's more of a mixed bag than it looks like. One of the things she points out is that by describing, by attributing to Jesus all this support and patronage and followers of women, the author is also doing something else, though, that is, he's making certain claims about how non-controversial Christianity is in the Roman Empire, and that what he's doing in part is domesticating women and therefore the church itself in weird kind of ways, or I don't actually want to talk about the church, but what for him is the Christian community. And so I guess my response to that would be, well, there are some other ways to understand Luke or the author of Luke and the author of Acts as an author that might not necessarily make you so happy to have Luke be a woman. This is kind of part of my point, that when you start to pay close attention to these things, you go, well, maybe I don't want the author of this text to be a woman. And I'm not saying you would feel that way. I can't speak for you, obviously, but I'm saying these things get to be more complicated. But I do think that the one thing I've thought about for a long time about this, and this is really my personal view, I don't know that it's my view as a scholar, although they're not unrelated, is that it's very difficult to pin our needs, our ideas about gender and what roles we think are appropriate for us to play in the communities we live in on the things people did a long time ago. And what makes that more complicated, of course, is that for some of us, those claims have other pieces to them. They're not just what people did a long time ago, but they come with all kinds of other authorization, right? Including for some people, a kind of divine authorization. And that makes it particularly tricky. And that's the debate that has been going on all along, right? Is the claim that it's not humans who come up with these arrangements. It's somehow my views are the divinely sanctioned views. And that makes it very, very complicated. So, yeah. You all know that.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Sadiqa is saying, I did my master's thesis on women and liberation in the fourth gospel 40 years ago. I came away with the idea that women must have had a role in the composition of the gospel attributed to John. Women are the heroes of the gospel. In contrast, most of the men come off pretty badly as disciples. Why would a man write something like this? That's for you.
Yeah, so you're not the only person who has raised those issues, and you may in fact probably know this. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza at one point did certainly at least run up the flagpole the possibility that the author of the Gospel of John was a woman. I don't know what to say. Now we're to these issues of method, right? And now we're to these questions of, can you tell a work by a woman by the characters or the persons in the story who are valorized, right? And maybe the answer to that is yes, that you can, but maybe the answer to that is there may be things that you don't or we don't understand. And so what reads to us as a story in which women are the women get it right and the men get it wrong doesn't necessarily map to the gender of the author. And I wish I knew how to adjudicate that. I think the only way you can is if you can come up with counterexamples, right? If you can come up with a text where that does go on, where the author is a male. And there are male authors in antiquity who defend the rights of women to study philosophy, all kinds of things. And I don't know what to tell you. I just want to add one thing to that. If that's what you think, do you think she was a Samaritan? Because the people who also come off really well in the Gospel of John are Samaritans. And I've always wondered about that issue as well.
Thank you. I'm going to just take one more because we're already at 8 o'clock. So John McNamara says, it would make sense that women were involved in the composition of the scriptures, since the scriptures were the product of communities who gave input into the composition of the texts. The issue of women's roles is important because it goes to the countercultural role of the gospel message. What's your comment to that?
This is another one of those, on the one hand, I think you're probably right. I don't think this stuff went on solely among men. And I think when you look at what goes on, certainly in later Christian churches, for which we have much better evidence, that's the kind of useful thing about, say, the 4th and 5th centuries. So we have much more information. We know much more about who these people were and what their lives are like and, what they're writing back and forth to each other. The problem with the 1st century is that we have such minimal data. I mean, you don't really ever want to be a historian of the first several decades of Christians because you have so little data. But I mean, on the one hand, sure. And you see this even in Paul's letters, which I think probably in some ways are better data, right? Where there are just women populating these letters all over the place. So sure, at one level, I think that's the case. But the next piece is, again, what is the so what of that? Does that guarantee the truth of the text? What does it do that matters? And I think that again is just a very thorny question, but sure.
Thank you so much. Well, we got most of our questions in the chat room tonight, but that's an okay way to get them as well. So
Deb, let me just say
Yeah,
one thing.
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
I know if you stop at 8, you stop at 8. This is a Zoom session. I'm assuming no, I mean, if people need to leave, but
Yeah.
I would be certainly happy to answer a few more questions or, just
Oh.
have people comment briefly. do you want me to take a look at the chat now?
Sure. I mean, yeah, if there's yeah, I'm happy. I just didn't want to impact your time any more than.
So yes, Jill Caldwell, thank you for looking up the text. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Let me see what else. All right, I'm seeing, I feel like I'm not, all right, let me scroll the other way. Okay, I will skip from that. Yes. Yeah, okay, so somebody raises, no, I think this is actually a direct message to me, so I will try to answer it subsequently. But let me just say one thing, if I lose the chat itself, Teresa, any of you can subsequently email me after this at ross_kraemer@brown.edu. I'm really easy to find. You have to spell my name right, but if you don't, just go to the Brown website and somewhere you'll find me. Okay, let me see this. Oh no, all right, so Teresa, you did then say this to everybody, good, so now I can do it. So Teresa said, if ancient women writers were unveiled, it would matter to women writers and philosophers and women in the church today. If I don't know now whether this is a literal, if they had to wear head coverings thing, or whether this is something more substantial. Are we now to the Montanists and the Orthodox? Is this an allegory, or are we talking about real practices?
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways the allegorical piece of it is more significant, and that's how I take your note, which is just to say here that the issue is the silencing of women, not what kinds of practices ordinary people have about, dress and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, all right, Peggy, yes, women seem to have a lot more agency in Luke. Yes, in some ways I think that's true. The larger question there, I think, is precisely because that is the case. What is the author trying to do by representing women in that way, compared, say, with the Gospel of Mark, where, women are pretty minor characters. All right, I think, all right, I'm just looking to see what else.
There's another one from Sadiqa that says,
can I comment on that very briefly?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Of Mary Magdalene from Paul's letters. Yeah, wow, right. I mean, the answer is yeah. I think that's a really significant issue, and particularly this. And I've actually written about this, and now I'm just trying to think, where the heck did I write about this? And I think it's probably in, oh Lord. I want to say that it's maybe in one of the pieces in Women in Christian Origins, but I'm not sure now that that's right. But this is a really, really interesting question, right? And particularly the absence of Mary or any women from Paul's descriptions of those who saw the resurrected Jesus. And there's kind of, at one level, there's two simplistic ways to take this. One is Paul knows those traditions and he has decided deliberately to omit them for whatever reasons he has. That being said, this is the guy who, has more women in his letters than, any of the Gospels combined. I mean, maybe Luke, I once did a count on this. In the Women in Scripture volume, the Women in Scripture anthology, in the introduction, I actually did do a count on this, so I won't try to remember it, but you could go look it up. But so either he knows this tradition and he chooses deliberately to conceal it, or he doesn't know it. Those are essentially your only two options. He knows it and he's hiding it. He doesn't know it. If he's hiding it, why is he hiding it? If he doesn't know it, why does he not know it? There's an uncomfortable explanation for this, and I will just put it out there, but I'm not putting it out there. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it is one possibility, which is that Paul doesn't know it because it has not actually yet been formulated, and that it is formulated in response to a very particular debate that you see already in Paul's letters, namely the resurrection, the nature of the resurrection. Is it in the body? Are we really talking about dead bodies raised up and sort of made alive again, or are we talking about something else? And Paul seems to say we're talking about something else. We're not talking about putting bodies in the ground and then having them come back alive. And so the stories that are told, particularly about Mary Magdalene and the women, is they see the body, they see Jesus, and they testify to the absence of the body from the tomb and then the subsequent appearance of Jesus. What problem does that solve? Right. Well, one of the problems it solves is the question of the nature of the resurrection. So another way to read that would be to say Paul does know those stories, and he doesn't like them because they are the counterpoint to his own arguments that the resurrection is not a resurrection of the dead bodies stuck in the ground and now brought back to life. So that's another way to think of it. Yes.
So maybe just one more. You see, Paul is the only one who
Yeah, I'm
identifies a
looking at
woman.
that.
Okay,
Phoebe.
okay. Yeah.
I'm not a fan of Paul, but he did give us Phoebe. Well, if by give us Phoebe, you mean he let us know about Phoebe. Well, I guess he lets us know about quite a lot of women who are interesting. Some people would say that I think the one who is actually in some ways even more important than Phoebe is, I'm going to blank on her name, Junia. Right. Whom Paul says basically is, well known among the apostles. So much so that, as Bernadette Bruton wrote a very important article about this, that Junia becomes, in the New Testament textual traditions, a man named Junius, because the idea that you would have a woman apostle, this creates serious problems. So, and we owe that one to Paul as well. So, I suppose whatever else it was he was trying to do, Paul's letters do provide us with a glimpses, at least, into a number of what are probably real women, more so, I think, than, some of the other figures, even that show up in Acts and things like that. And Sandra Schneider's no clue. I can't even touch that one. I have absolutely no idea.
That's great. Thanks, Nika. That's a great one to end with.
It is a great one to end with. No idea.
So, thank you so much, Ross. It would be lovely just to sit here for hours because you have such a wealth of knowledge and such an interesting take. Brings us out of our old habits. So, but I'm going to turn this back over to Russ. Not Ross, but Russ.
Yes, Russ. Right. And can I just say one thing again? Really, sure. I'm very serious about this, both to those of you whom I know and don't see, and those of you whom I don't know. Please feel free to email me, ross_kraemer@brown.edu. It's a really easy email address.
We'll put that in. We send out an email with everything afterwards, and we'll put in that.
With people. Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, good.